Hi everybody, welcome to Talking Automotive with Mark and John. My name's John Sinclair and my co-host Mark Palomestro.
Hi, today we've got Ben Sullivan. Ben's the Managing Director of Ad Clarity and the Head of Automotive Services at Potentiate. Ben joined us previously in one of our earlier podcasts and gave some very insightful detail around purchase intention, ownership, and trends in the automotive industry from a customer perspective. He revisits these trends, so we cover up what he has seen through COVID-19 with some very interesting trends appearing in who's buying cars, what they're buying, how long they're keeping them, and even the all-important where are we at from an EV, hybrid, and what does the future hold.
Yeah, Ben has a really great way of delving into the data and coming up with some very interesting insights. So let's jump into it.
With 30 years' experience in auto logistics and state-of-the-art locations in 5 major Australian cities, Precar Fleet Services is an independent division of Precar Services, offering specialty fleet fit-outs for commercial applications ranging from simple tray and tow bar fitments to fully bespoke service body and accessory installation. With quality-assured safety, compliance and standardisation of vehicle builds, Precar Fleet Services are a premier all-in-one solutions provider for commercial vehicle fleet operators, leasing companies, and original equipment manufacturers. For further information on how Precar Fleet Services can assist in solving your commercial vehicle fit-out needs, please visit precar.com.au and click on the link to Fleet Services.
Before we jump into today's episode, here's a quick word from our sponsor.
CarsApp is a digital platform across both web and app clients that helps sellers of motor vehicle assets to reach and transact with a larger audience in the B2B space. CarsApp allows you to seamlessly and efficiently list your wholesale inventory either by DMS integration or manual entry and then transact either via a tender format or in the marketplace. Why let your wholesale inventory only be made available to a limited number of buyers when you can tap into an engaged buyer marketplace on CarsApp with a national reach of over 800 plus registered users? Increase your audience and improve your returns on your wholesale stock. Connect with CarsApp via LinkedIn or on the web at carsapp.com.au or reach out directly to Andrew Tyson at andrew.tyson@carsapp.com.au.
Welcome, Ben.
Thank you very much, Mark, and great to be here. And hi, John, how are you?
Yeah, Ben, great to have you on the show again. We always enjoy talking to you because the data always tells the truth, and it's just fascinating talking, getting into that detail on that. So welcome to the show. Maybe to kick things off, can you maybe just tell us a little bit about vehicle purchase intentions and how the trends have changed since COVID, or now that we're starting to track out of COVID?
Yeah, look, it's been really interesting from my perspective, and again, coming at it from a data perspective, because, certainly I would think if we reflect back to where we were, almost literally a year ago, I think we were all, the Chicken Little sky was falling in, and, we were all preparing for absolute devastation. And certainly, I think if you look at vehicle purchases through to kind of June, it was pretty dire. The one thing I do think that was happening was that we created a bit of an illusion for ourselves in that a lot of the cars that went out during those, the March, April, May, were probably cars that were in fact ordered well pre-COVID. If you look at the models that popped high then, they were vehicles that we know are on back order. And I think that's been something very, very interesting to see. But as those lockdowns around the country started to ease, we had people turning back up at the market. But what we have seen is, I guess, an acceleration of trends that we were seeing before. And if anything, I think COVID has contributed to it, not only directly, but also indirectly, in that we are no longer able to travel overseas. And I'm sure we'd all realise that there's a hell of a lot of, there's a lot of Australians that like to travel overseas, be it to Bali or to jump on a cruise ship or whatever. But a good chunk of those people are what I would call the boomers, the baby boomers. They're retired and they've got their income sorted out. Now, what happens, I think, a couple of things I think are going on. Firstly, if I can't go overseas, I've got money in the bank that I was intending to spend. So that's kind of caused the market to bump a little bit. But what we're seeing is, in fact, again, an acceleration of the shift that was being driven by economic stagnation. In the years preceding COVID, what I had noticed was that the buyer mix was rapidly aging, but at a level that I would not expect to see if it was just the population alone. So what I started to do was to pull apart the various trends that we were seeing not so much in terms of percentages, but in terms of raw volumes, to start to see where those declines were coming. And one of the things that we've seen, and it's absolutely continuing, is essentially the middle Australia, or what I would call families with kids. Now, I think last time we talked about the fact that only a third of the market is family with kids, and that's actually gone down even further. And the oldies are taking up more of the market. But if I sort of extrapolate those things together, it's, the boomers were relatively unaffected by the economic consequences of COVID. They were probably already largely sitting at home, but they can't go overseas anymore. But they weren't losing their jobs because they didn't have jobs to lose. And despite the weird stock market things, that happened very quickly, it bounced ridiculously. And I think if you talk to a lot of economists, they don't think it makes a lot of sense what's going on in the stock market. It seems very detached from reality. And I think, honestly, what we're seeing, and I know there's a lot of optimism in the industry and sales do look good, but I would always challenge them to say, well, look good compared to what? Because I can guarantee you that if we start to look at these sales versus even 17 or 16, they'd still look diabolical. If we get to 2019, which was one of our worst years ever, I think people would be really happy. So in other words, whatever the recovery we're undergoing, it's not a recovery back to where we have been. It's simply not as bad as it was. And so one of the things that we noticed kind of coming through to the end of the year is the way this kind of what I would almost call a K-shaped recovery, in that, and they do talk about this in the literature, there's this idea that, let's say, the rich or the relatively rich are left relatively unscathed by something, so they can recover much more quickly. But it's that, the unwashed masses, I don't know, whatever you want to call them, the vast majority of middle Australia, they are still feeling it. So what we've got is this money coming out of the boomers because they can't spend it anywhere else. They do want to go on holiday, so they're buying their Land Cruisers. And I'm sure you guys would have all heard that you couldn't buy a new caravan for love nor money at the moment, let alone an off-road trailer, let alone a converted VW Combi. You can't get these things because suddenly there's a demand for them, because it's these boomers going, well, if I can't go to Italy this summer, why don't I go up north or go west or whatever? So you've got it's almost accessorizing their holidays. And I think you'll find that it's not just the vehicles, it's all other kind of paraphernalia associated with traveling in Australia. What that's also done, though, is, I guess, why luxury has been less impacted. Or certainly if you look across the brands, the Lux brands were less affected because they are the people who buy, the boomers are the people that buy luxury cars too. So again, it's this middle Australia that just aren't feeling flush. And what's exacerbating their condition is that new car sales go down, ergo used car availability goes down, ergo price for said used car goes up because demand supply. And so you've got this kind of, again, it's like you're squeezing that middle part of Australia really hard. We might be getting jobs. There's a lot of celebration, all these jobs are coming back, but I don't see it being coupled with wage growth, for example. So in other words, you're going from I'm going to be in the streets soon to, phew, I'll keep a roof over my head, but I'm not feeling flush. And honestly, I can't see that coming back for quite a long time. There's a lot of other macroeconomic forces that are driving that. We see all of that kind of thing. And, the other trends we're definitely seeing, cars just keep dying. There's quite a number of brands who really don't sell passenger cars anymore. I looked recently, Mitsubishi has one. They've still got the Mirage, and you can see Ford really only sells a Focus now, and we've got Nissan that doesn't sell anything except the Leaf. And certainly we're really seeing medium SUV, small SUV, and light SUV pumping up. What is interesting, and I've seen some press around Land Cruisers and Prados, for example, the big SUVs, volumetrically speaking, they're flat. They're quite again, pretty strong, but again, what we're seeing is the buyer profile is shifting into a bit more into that older group. But the other interesting thing I'm seeing, I guess, is that both the large and particularly the medium SUV, almost not fragmenting, but there are two quite distinct buyer groups in there. Again, it's one of the surprises to people, particularly, maybe the advertising folk. You could look at who buys, light SUVs and small SUVs. And if you looked at the ads, you'd assume it was all young people, but it's not. It's 50-year-old couples, second car, often additional. But the medium SUV is really interesting because, again, we're seeing two sets of needs buying it. It's dominated by older couples who don't need 7 seats, for example, who don't necessarily want off-road, they're not really in it for the kids. It's really for them and their gear. But you've still got, again, interestingly, then there's that family group. And what I also think is really interesting, when you look at that family group, the large SUV buyer and the medium SUV buyer look almost identical except for one thing: income. In other words, if you've got the money, you'll buy a large SUV. If you don't, you'll make a compromise and get a medium SUV that's almost as big as the large one. So again, it starts to tell me that there's probably opportunity to think about different sorts of SUVs, think about different marketing strategies. But we've certainly, absolutely seen, unfortunately, I guess, not the death of the car, but it's certainly waning in Australia. The medium and large cars now are virtually non-existent. I think medium might sit at 2 or 3% of the market, large virtually zero, and small cars that were once 25% of the market are now well south of 20%. So again, fascinating shift in the car park in terms of what's being bought versus what's being replaced. But really quite interesting in watching how the buyer demographics, or the people who are turning up, are changing the way the market ends up being expressed. And I think that does tell us some interesting things.
Now, Ben, you mentioned in our last catch-up that over 50 bought new vehicles than people under 30. Has that changed, or has it accentuated since the recovery from the pandemic initial shock? Is there still more people over 50 that are buying new cars than under 30?
Yeah, look, it's absolutely accelerated. We've got last year, I think it was about 52% of the market were over 50. And if I start going through that even further, you've got certainly more 65 pluses buying than under 30s. And that has accelerated because, again, it's not even down to desire. It's who's got the money, who's got the spare cash. And certainly one of the things we have seen is that while the market has declined overall, I think if I remember the stats about right, the overall market has declined about 26%. This is, I think, it's a 2019 through 16 kind of decline. It declined about a quarter, from well over 1 million down to well under 1 million kind of thing in that period. But what we saw was that the biggest decline was amongst the families with kids. The second biggest decline, and that was at about 32%, I think, from memory. Then you had a 24% decline amongst the under 30s, but only an 8% decline in those over 50s. In other words, everybody's hurting a little bit, but some people are hurting more than others or less than others, depending on how you. Absolutely, it's accelerating. In other words, more of the market is older. But what I'm afraid of personally is that the industry seems to be making an assumption that this is kind of, and again, it's probably a gut feel that young people don't want cars anymore. But I really would countenance against that because I don't believe that's true for a large variety of reasons. But in its most simple terms, is cars are, if you're not flush, you're not going to buy them. You'd probably buy used if you could. But even if I don't buy one now, by the time I've got children, I don't know about you, but I don't think my wife would have let me get away with not having a car when I had children. Just in case of accidents or any of those sorts of things where you really do need transport instantly. And so I believe that while maybe car ownership is a little bit less prevalent among young people, the minute they hit that kind of slightly older stage, slightly more mature, I'm damn sure they're going to go out and buy cars. The reason they're not coming to the market is because they can't afford to under the current macroeconomic environment. But look, one other little sort of side note on that one thing I do think is very interesting is the rise of MG. What they were 11th in January, I believe, which sort of points to, I think, almost substitution with used cars, in the sense that I can get a 7-year warranty, which takes a lot of fear away, but I can get one, at a reasonable price. So that's probably almost propping up some of those, machinations in the marketplace. People are going, can't find a used one, but that new one looks okay, and with 7-year warranties, it'll pick up. The other thing I think that's interesting that I don't know that the industry can see all that clearly, but I happen to have a look at the average price pay for vehicles. And one of the things I noticed was that through last year, we essentially saw an increase of about $5,000 in the price of the average car sold, from about 45 up to about 50K. Now, that tells me, again, a lot of things about what sorts of vehicles are being sold and also then who's turning up to buy them. Because the one thing I'm damn sure of is that the price for the individual cars themselves did not go up. It is that the mix shifted. In other words, it shifted to that higher end, which is, and again, when you look at the volumes, it's not that grew massively back to where it was. It's more that the lower end fell away even more. So again, it feels like, let's say, the new car market that maybe through the highs of the 2015, 2016, when the market was booming and we're all cheering about it, that was when middle Australia could afford to buy a new car, and new cars looked achievable for many people. But then if you look at it now, the world is tight. A lot of people feeling a little bit tight. House prices are going through the roof. A lot of these people just won't have the spare money. But new car prices going up because the people who are buying them can afford it. The other people simply are not showing up. So again, really interesting little shifts in the marketplace, accelerating something was coming, but that probably won't be turned around until such time as the total economy starts to make people feel a little bit flush. So yeah, my overall sense is the market is going to struggle to get anywhere near where it has been for quite a number of years, until such time as the overall economy starts to grow and wages grow.
And Ben, with LCVs, you mentioned passenger and SUVs. What are you seeing in the buyer demographics of the LCV buyer?
Couple of very interesting question. First thing I noticed just on that one was I did see some really interesting things through the June results, because if you remember, the government put out a whole, instant asset write-off thing, and two things I noticed. Firstly was that I had not seen a small fleet volume or mix level anything like what we saw in June ever before. And I've been looking at this for a long time. In other words, it was just so heavily small fleets. In other words, all these little businesses thought, oh, you beauty, I can come out and I'll get myself a new car because the government's given me an instant asset write-off. Now, there's absolutely no doubt that pumped utes up, the LCVs up dramatically. But I also noticed another thing was that the instant asset write-off was also behind the huge bump in Lux, because it's all, we might not think of them. I think when we all think of the small business owner, we tend to put them in a ute and, assume they're a plumber or a sparky or something like that. But what we saw was, again, a bunch of, let's call them architects or doctors or accountants or whatever, going, beautiful, I've got the cash, so therefore I can dump that knowing that it'll pay back on the tax return. So that is a really interesting thing. Other thing that I've noticed as well, though, is that it's not only that LCVs are being bumped up not only by the tradies, they are being bumped up by this older group of buyers for whom, again, at a budget level, if I want to tow a caravan, I could buy a Prado or I could buy a Triton 4x4. Not much difference in towing capacity, but a shitload of difference in purchase price. And I do think we're seeing that. Certainly utes have evolved dramatically from when I came into the industry, when it was pretty much exclusively 2 seats and 2-wheel drive. Now it's pretty much all 4-wheel drive and 5 seats. Very, very different vehicles. So, yeah, look, there's some interesting things going on. I was having a bit of a look at the garages and additional vehicle buys, and certainly one thing I do see is an over-indexing of utes or LCVs as additional cars in older couple households. Now, why? It's because of their grey nomading, right? They're using it as a way of getting out of town, living the dream, whatever you want to call it. So, yeah, some interesting thing. The blurry line. Commercial vehicle, not so much. There's a hell of a lot of those vehicles that are bought as literally private vehicles now. Yeah, and there's some brands fairly obviously like that. But again, quite different markets, different needs, and you can see that in the vehicle mixes.
And that's interesting because when you mentioned before, if you look at some of what are the mainstream brands selling those LCVs above what the luxury car brand average would be from an average purchase price. So things like large SUVs and large LCVs or top-end LCVs in that same volume. So those buyers would take advantage of that instant asset write-off, as would the builders, etc. So it's the SMEs and anyone who's professional who could write that off. You either bought a premium car or you bought a premium LCV or SUV.
Yeah, it is interesting. I think that, I don't think, I think it'd be a little bit too generalised to say it's part of the changing Aussie male. But, predominantly, I guess it is. But, those vehicles are certainly almost status symbols now. I remember an interesting bit of research I did many years ago about why people, for example, bought a Calais or a Fairlane, for example. And what we found was quite interesting was that essentially they were being bought by people who were getting the richer point in their life. The kids had left home, but they didn't want to go into a BMW or a Mercedes because they would look like wankers in their terms amongst their mates. And I do think what we're seeing is there's an element that if you want to show that you're doing okay, you do it by buying a fancy tricked up LCV. And in other words, it's almost like it's a new set of clothes that a lot of people love to wear. And certainly the area I live, that's almost de rigueur is what you should be buying. The dad has a ute and the mum has a whopping great big SUV. I'm in a semi-rural area. So you do see that. So I think there is that element of tricking it up. But then as you rightly point out, one of the advantages of rules like that is I could buy it for my small business, but I get to drive it on the weekends. And I think that's what it is. It's that very much that it can do 2 tricks here. It can do the work thing, but I'm proud to drive it rather than it being just a workhorse. I don't think many people call them workhorses anymore. I was chatting to a mate of mine recently who was just driving one of the newer Hiluxes, and he was saying it's almost a shame. It's almost too car-like. It shouldn't feel so nice. Why can't I hose it out? And it's that kind of sense that they're almost going beyond their original purpose. So I do think there's an element of because there's no doubt there's the young show ponies who are doing it. They're living at home and living the dream, and they'll save up and they'll get themselves a tricked up Ranger or something like that. But there are all those tradies and all those people who might perhaps in the past have bought a sedan or an SUV going, you know what? I like the way this looks, doesn't feel like a truck, and I like the way I feel when I drive it. But, again, it's gone up as a mix. Again, June last year, never seen utes as high as a proportion of total vehicle sales, and it's holding. Not at that kind of level, but it's certainly holding up from where it was 12 months ago.
Now, Ben, you've seen an increased activity online, and we're not quite yet at that people doing the full purchase online. But what are the trends you're seeing at the moment with online activities?
Look, it's a really interesting thing. We had a bit of a look at how interested were people in online purchase just before COVID, and we kind of got the reading back in saying that around about 12-15% of people would be actually quite interested in buying a vehicle online. One thing we do know is in general, people don't really like buying cars. It's not the experience, it's that dealer experience that they want to skip, right? Now, one of the interesting things that COVID did was it forced the whole of the industry to start to rethink how I might manage a sale. And okay, so look, there is some interest, and certainly I know there's a lot of brands out there talking up online purchase. Yeah, and I do think that there is, as a result of COVID, when people have in so many ways rethought the way we do normal things, it is a great moment for the industry to get its head around what might a future sale process look like that is started and finished online. Because if I go through the vehicle purchase process, the bits that people really don't like, they don't like the pressure to buy, that kind of, you hear at the end of the month, are you going to buy today? I'm not going to talk to you if you're not going to buy today, all of that crap. But they probably dislike even more that enforced sit that happens at the end, which is sit in this office, we'll haggle, I'll leave, I'll go talk to my manager, and we'll finally agree on a price, and then we'll fill out the paperwork, and then you got to deal with the finance people, and if you've got the contract, you've got to go through all of that, and then you cop the Ming person. In other words, the dealership experience focuses on creating this horrible piece that really can be done at home or should be able to be done at home. And I think, I've seen it quite a number of OEMs. I know that, Volkswagen's out in public talking about the fact that they're doing it. I know Audi is doing it. I've heard Kia say they're going there. Hyundai say they're going there. Volvo, there's so many brands that want to move online. And there's a whole lot of political stuff that goes on with it, right? How's it going to be managed? Who's going to do it? But I think there are ways through it, and I've kind of worked through it. But I think the challenge, we've got two challenges, one of which is that most, if not all, of the efforts to move a car online now, it's probably not really actually an online experience. In other words, it's just a fancy way of getting you to the dealership. In other words, it doesn't really feel all that different. But again, I think if brands can kind of get their heads around how that process works, how you do it without offending dealers, but also, most importantly, how do you do a test drive? Well, when the person doesn't really want to come into a dealership other than to test drive or just go somewhere to test drive a vehicle. I can tell you that, interestingly, it may surprise you, about 2/3 of people test drive a vehicle before they buy the vehicle, which makes sense. But the other third, you kind of think, well, what about those people? Most of them are people who are buying the same vehicle again. In other words, they don't need to. I know what it is. I'm just replacing it because I always do, and I'm buying another Hilux or whatever. Don't worry about the test drive. It's fine. Just order it for me. But given that 2/3 of people are changing segments when they rebuy, so I'll just reset another fascinating one for the industry that makes the assumption that if I bought a small car last time, I'm going to buy a small car again. That's not anywhere near. It's about 40%. About the highest of the standard medium SUVs, it's about 50%. Utes, 70%. But both the car park shift and life stage shift means people are moving cars, moving segments every time they rebuy. Challenge is that on average, that is 8 years apart. And I think that's where the online purchase thing is going to find it a little interesting, is that if most people only go through the market once every 8 years, to see the full ramifications of the move online, again, is going to take a decade or so, because it takes a long time. If you imagine in any given year, all these people are new to the market for the last 8 years, so they're all relearning how to do this and discovering how you can do it. But I do think there is a huge opportunity for the OEMs to get around a lot of the problems that they have now, largely to do with what happens to customers when they show interest. They lose sight. They see the customer up online, and most of those people will not leave you a lead. I reckon if a brand could get 10% of its potential customers to leave a lead online, that'd all be cheering. It's probably more like 5%. So there's 95% of people go silent. Why? Because they've got that option of going to a dealer. And they don't want to give the lead to the dealership. It's not because they don't want to tell you they don't want to buy a car. What they don't want to be is hassled. to buy a car. However, if we can break that nexus and start getting people to think, well, look, okay, I'm interested in driving one of these cars, or I'm interested in buying one. Do I need to go offline to do it? But then I do my test drive, or I just move straight to ordering online. Yeah, and literally go through identity verification process. I mean, I'm sure you guys have been through passport checkpoints and the sort of internet banking that we can do now, where you're doing liveness testing, and there's all sorts of really good ways of validating who somebody is, and you can sign finance contracts and do all sorts of things online. Why can't you buy a car? It actually doesn't make a lot of sense to me that part of the process is so antiquated that nobody can build an easy to complete online form where somebody specifies the vehicle they want, then arranges finance or puts a deposit down. Then it goes into vehicle ordering system, and then the vehicle could get dropped, either dropped to their house, or they can be notified when it's ready for pickup from a dealership, complete the final bits of paperwork, walk in, grab your keys and leave. That's where I think we should be going to. It's where I think a lot of customers would feel a lot more comfortable, but we've got to get, let's say, the will of the manufacturers and the dealers to support that. I was quite interested to see that I think it was AP Eagers AHG announced that they're opening a store, a dealership inside a shopping centre. And they talked about a whole lot of convenience things, which I completely agree with. The thing that I was most interested to see, though, is there was no talk of how they would make the experience any better. And I think that's the bit that's why will online work, is because it's a way for people to avoid the stuff they don't like. And if dealers wanted to make it nice to buy a car, that would probably slow it down. But I think we all know we've got to give customers choice, and some people want to go that way. It's now going to be who does it well, who designs a good process. I've seen feedback about some of the manufacturers' online initiatives, and a lot of it's not good. In other words, the process is painful. So again, it'll come down to process design. I don't think a lot of them have actually thought about all of the stages of buying a car.
And this is interesting. We interviewed Michelle Denogian from an organisation, the US Roadster, and it's just fascinating to see how far the US is ahead of the Australian market with the whole omni-channel, and recognising that it's not just online, it's actually a mix of both. And what you've just described, Ben, is fascinating, because when Michelle covered off the problems that they've encountered is that certain dealerships went to this online, but then you had this analog process back in the dealership again. So you spent your time online, but then you ended up back in this old school dealership experience. Whereas what they've found is that if you actually embrace Omni, do the digital bit, but then integrate it into the fact that you're going to still do some of the mechanical processes or analog processes in dealership, but already have that pre-filled out information. Each sales consultant can actually sell more cars because the journey is actually being done by the customer, and you're really just getting down to the bits that have to be executed in showroom because you've created such a really good experience. But the challenge is actually mapping it all together. And that's fascinating that you see in the data that there still is, at least in this market, that disconnect where, okay, they've had a digital experience, but then it's not connected to what actually happens in showroom.
But it's fascinating to hear that. I wish I'd listened to that that podcast, because, again, that's the sort of things that we've observed are the problems with what people are doing. I don't think they've thought it well through, and it kind of defeats the point, and people will abandon it if it defeats the point, right? If I end up doing analog, it's, why would I do that? And there's a couple of OEMs where I've done some work looking at the sort of shape, and one of the classic ones that you raise there is, I've been looking at this beautiful car, I spec'd it up, can't save it, can't send the spec to anybody, and I can't get a price for it. Like, what the, everything else you can. Why do you guys want to control it that much?
We're steering those clients of yours to that podcast with the Omni-channel with Michelle.
A little project that I'm working on at the moment is we've found some really good software that will help with all of that validation and, kind of literal identification stuff that gets us through all of that. And we are going to stitch together a bit of a complete omni-channel kind of solution, which has what you described is persistence. In other words, I don't care where in the ecosystem you go, what you've done before will follow you there. So in other words, you can turn up at the dealership, you can book the test drive, you turn up, you don't do anything, they hand you the keys and off you go. And then they say, look, okay, do you like the car? Yeah, but I'll finish it at home. Yeah, I'll finish the purchase. Or you could come in here. And so what you're going to do is get lower transactional prices because all that time's not wasted. You're going to get less of that paper pushing. And we might actually see salespeople become, genuinely caring and wanting to help people because they realise that the customer can go do all that stuff themselves. And maybe they'll haggle less with price too. I don't know. I just feel like it's an experience that so many people, including probably half of the population who are not our gender, would really think that was a nice thing, right? To not deal with the snake oils. It's exactly where we need to go, but the industry is hard to move, as you all know.
Absolutely. And just one other question as far as trends. With fuel trends, we saw diesel was a very trendy fuel in the recent journey. Petrol, diesel, and LPG. I'm keen to get your take on what you say to those three fuel types.
Okay, LPG, I'll start with the one that I think, unfortunately, in a lot of ways is fading, LPG. Really quite big, and I did quite a bit of work on it. Its potential a decade or so ago. However, because it's not really supported by any of the OEMs, really difficult. It's always an aftermarket conversion. Diesel is probably the most interesting one to me in that it had a few years ago an absolute spike, in interest, and it was, it suddenly had moved out of its comfort zone in utes and big like really big proper SUVs, and it started to emerge inside as a valid, fuel type in medium SUVs. I mean, you obviously saw Foresters and Outbacks coming in diesel. We saw all these other little players coming through selling vehicles diesel, and at that time, there was a lot of greenwashing. In other words, people were trying to make out that you don't use much fuel, even if it's a bit more expensive, but you're not using much fuel, so therefore it's good for the environment. But that was never true. Diesel is simply bad for humans, shall we say, and probably the world. But what we see is intention to buy diesel is really going down quite rapidly, which I think is interesting. And it's being matched by an increase in intention to buy EVs, or at least to consider them, and hybrids. Certainly, if I look at something like the RAV4 phenomenon, what it does show is that if you put a hybrid engine in a nameplate that is well known and that drives pretty much like the normal one, but costs you less to own, and it's not priced excessively, you can do really well. The thing that I think is particularly interesting about that, though, is that, again, the part of the market that's driving that is not young, trendy people. It's not young tech heads. It's older people. 70% of the EVs that we see sold are sold to people over 50. In other words, almost all of them. Why? Because they've got the money to be safe and comfortable doing that. They're not afraid to do it. And again, that's the permission is I've got some money. But one thing that's really interesting, EVs now and hybrids sitting up at about 20-odd% intention, an absolutely marked rise since the start of last year. I think one of the other interesting, consequences perhaps of COVID, I'm sure we all remember seeing those photos of Wuhan, when all the factories had shut down, when we heard about, how quiet and how much less fuel we're putting out because all those planes weren't going on. We started to realise that maybe it was time to do a little bit of something about that. And so there's absolutely been a lift. But the same thing's happening. We're seeing higher intention, like intention that is absolutely way over what actually happens. And I do think I kind of hear a lot about, well, why aren't we moving? Why isn't it moving faster? And it's pretty simple. There's not a good range yet. People buy a car to do something, to live a life that they want to lead. They don't buy it because of its method of propulsion. In other words, if you can once the mix improves and the price differential is much closer, I reckon we'll go crazy. I really do. I think that, even despite our government still not doing anything to actively encourage it. You look at Norway, they're 60%, I think now, of all new vehicle sales are EV. So that you can clearly do it. But again, I just don't think Australians want to. And I don't think the range is here. When you compare that with our taste in vehicles. I think it's almost like it's the right fit. Australia's big on medium SUVs. How many EVs of those are out in Australia? None. There's the Audi and the Tesla. That's probably the only two medium SUV true EVs. So I think we've got a long way to go where the market needs to catch up to what the buyers would be willing to buy.
And another question with the EVs, you mentioned before about the hybrids and EVs. Now, with EV, there's the pure electric cars. Then there's petrol electric hybrids. So they're mainly a petrol car with an electric hybrid additional system. And then there are plug-in hybrids, which is an electric car with a petrol range extender. Are you seeing a difference between those three types?
Not really. I don't think people actually, I think one of the biggest problems we've got is just simply knowledge and experience. One of the things that we look at is, when we look at how interested they are, is how much experience have people had with these vehicles? And the simple reality is that for most people, it's none. They don't encounter them in their daily lives. So it's not part of a normal for them yet. I don't think it's meaningfully understood what the difference between those. Certainly the EV versus hybrid, yes, but those subtle nuances within don't mean much to most people yet. We're just simply not mature enough. I think it would be akin to asking most people about what does variable valve timing do versus not in a petrol engine. I don't know. Well, I don't know. It's got letters in front of it.
So with a hybrid, with a petrol electric hybrid, range is not an issue. So there's no range anxiety with those vehicles. And if they look like a normal car, a la the Corolla and the RAV, so it's a petrol car with an electric drive system, you're not going to be stuck if you run out of charge. You don't have to plug it in to charge it. You can just operate it and it runs on both systems and alternates between the two. And it's not, I think it's not $5,000 more expensive to have one versus a mono fuel vehicle. So if you tick those boxes right now, you fit the bill in Australia. Whereas if you are the other extreme, which is a full EV plug-in electric vehicle with no range extension, range anxiety is an issue, and you are paying a premium for that car because it's 100% battery, so you're not paying $5,000 more than an equivalent ICE vehicle. You're paying tens of thousands of dollars more for that vehicle. And is that where you're saying that there's the issue whether there's a resistance to take it up?
Absolutely. Yeah, I think that's what that ease, or that, let's say, I'd call it a partial transition for the Corolla and the RAV has been an absolutely beautiful way of doing it, because it gives people that opportunity to go there in the first place without that fear. But there's absolutely no doubt that range is the people's big problem. But like a lot of things, the problem I have with that is their actual driving behaviours do not warrant that range anxiety. The average punter drives 20, 40 kilometres a day. There's no EV that you can't do that on comfortably. And it's about a change in habit. One of the things I've been thinking about recently is, well, depending on how we go with EVs, what happens with petrol stations? Huge amounts of valuable real estate, all to be putting petrol into things. But if people are charging their vehicles at home, for example, what happens to those things? How will they reinvent themselves? But that's probably another whole conversation about what you need to do, with if you're in the petrol station business. But to me, it's very much about, gradually tipping, more and more people will get there. We'll start to see that the infrastructure's there. If we know people that have had one, you can have a chat to them and say, is it that weird? No. One of the things I was actually really loved about looking at some of the comments from people who are buying the EVs is they're less talking about how amazingly different it is. They're actually more likely to talk about how same it is, but it's cheaper to run. That's what they're looking for. I kind of almost think of it that the Prius may, in fact, have been, it was certainly from an engineering perspective, an incredibly useful thing for Toyota to have done. But by making it so different, it almost made it harder to sell because it's a look at me thing. Whereas something that looks just the same with a little badge on it, nobody knows, it's only for me, and it's that sense that it's not that different. And that's RAV and Corolla. It's the same. It feels the same, but I'm just not spending as much money. One thing that strikes me, we've got 20% of the population saying they're willing to, but we only see less than 3% actually doing it. And so we've got to sort of hypothesize, where is that intention going? The first thing I think we would see is simply the range and the price. I might want to, but there's nothing on offer that works for me to meet my transport needs. I think the first thing we will need to do is, when the range increases and the price comes down, probably all heard of the Audi e-tron, about the same size as a Q5, but probably 50, 60 grand more expensive. Does the same thing, basically. And that's going to be hard to justify until the marketplace can normalise the price of batteries and get it down somewhere equivalent. It will never be mainstream. So again, if I then think about the shifts through the car park with that, if we got 3%, even if we get it to 10%, we're going to be seeing Australians drive around in internal combustion engines for the next 20 odd years. It's going to take us a long time unless to shift over. So petrol stations will still be here. Traditional service centres will still be here. We've got a long way to go. At 100% from tomorrow, we'd be mid-2030s before half the cars on Australian roads were electric. So, long way to go. It's coming. The market and the manufacturers need to match the product with what people want. And then I think we'll get acceleration. It's not the EV bit that's selling it. The EV is an alternative to an internal combustion engine. In the end, what am I carrying and where am I going? That's all that I need to know. And if you've got one that does it with electricity, that's great. The other thing I'd love to see, by the way, is people like our venerable Prime Minister learn a little bit about what EVs can do. I don't know if you all remember back in the last election, it was like, the Labor's trying to, kill the weekend by making us all drive EVs because that'll kill utes. It's like, hold on. Tesla are building a Cybertruck. I don't think it's got anything to do with utes or towing people. Let's get a little bit of education out there. Let's stop perpetuating myth. So, look, it really interesting. I can't wait. Personally, I'm a big believer. I love them. But I just watch Australia struggle towards it. It's quite painful.
Ben, in terms of ownership, I know we spoke a lot last time about the average ownership of vehicles. Are you seeing any changes in that ownership and then servicing times and schedules?
Look, one of the things, I've had a bit of a look at it. Obviously there is a lot of activity, should we go, say, on warranty lengths, right? And if I go back to not so long ago, 3 years was standard. If you only got 3 years now, you're backward. 5 is standard, quite a few with 7, one with 10. 10-year warranties. And if I kind of think about, well, why were they doing that? It's got to be, surely, we know that people stop servicing with you when they're, within dealership, when your warranty ends. And we are absolutely seeing that happening. What I'm seeing is definite trends in retention at 5 years of ownership, which to me is absolute evidence that if you do put a warranty up, you will have a couple more years to get to know that customer and do a good job, earn their trust so that you can keep them for the next 3 years to get to average length, but then potentially beyond that as well. What I don't see, honestly, though, is enough supporting activity by the OEMs to give them reasons to stay. I often look at the data and I kind of say, well, why are customers leaving? And they will all tend to say, oh, look, it's because we must have done something wrong or because they're cut. It's funny, when you look at the data, it's actually not. It's more that people will leave you or your dealership to go to someone else that they already know and trust more then they trust you. In other words, it's not so much that you caused them to leave, you didn't give them a reason to stay. Now, what I would suggest is extending warranties like this to both psychologically play on people in the sense that, oh, my warranty's only valid if I service with you. But what it should be is an opportunity to build loyalty by giving a better relationship. In other words, they are getting a benefit from it, but I still think they could get a lot more out of it. So that, I think, is quite an interesting little outcome. What we are seeing, though, again, I'm going to be really curious to watch how this year's data pulls through. I do have a sneaking suspicion that we are going to see a further increase in the average length of ownership because and that will be because those people simply choose to not come back. Why? Because the cars are fine. I've noticed, for example, I mean, there's a couple of things that'll do that, but one of which is simply that the people who find, about the proportion of buyers paying cash has gone up again. I think it's at about 52% now, again, driven by the older market. Finance is most often used by the families with kids, and they're simply not buying nearly as much as they were. So what I think we're going to see is, and we also know that most people don't technically finish their contracts, they buy them out, their finance contract. I just think we're going to see a whole lot of people hanging on to their cars for longer because, quite frankly, most cars at 8 years are still perfectly fine. And how do you create the desire to buy new when I'm not feeling all that flush?
That's actually an interesting point you raise, because I often wondered, Reeve, the consequence of giving longer warranty is that you don't have a reason to update. Like in the past, you'd be petrified if your car was 3 years old, you only had a 1 year warranty. You're really taking a risk with exposure to engine failures and the like. Now, products are a lot more reliable than they were previously. And I'm just wondering whether this is evidence that longer warranties actually discourage users from turning their cars over quicker. If we look at the fleet space, when warranties went out to 3 years, a lot of those government fleets would, in the old days, used to turn their cars over every 2 years. So they would take advantage, and this is even go back pre-GST, they'd have this sales tax benefit, and then they would turn the car over so they didn't have a maintenance exposure, and then they pushed it out to 3 years. And now you've got warranties of 5 and 7 and now this other one at 10, whether that will actually have a detrimental effect on those brand loyals where they'll say, well, I'll keep my car to the end of my warranty, then I'll replace it because I've got peace of mind all the way out now to that 7 years as a minimum and potentially 10.
It's an interesting one, actually, because I know mixed up in a lot of those warranty conversations are conversations about improved used vehicle value. And the characteristics of the buyers that turn the cars over quicker, they tend to be more lease customers. They're a certain type of buyer that will do it. But if I then look at the reason that the majority of people kind of decide to buy a new car, it's mostly already down to, I've got new needs. In other words, there was something else. Like, it wasn't that I did it because it was something that I set out to do. It was like, oh my God, my kids have grown up, but there is a bit of that kind of, oh, my car's falling apart. But that tends to be, again, amongst the much older cars. It's the 12-year-old car. So look, it'll be a really interesting play because, again, if I thought there were two things that you would do it for, one of which is because it's a pissing competition to try to get people across the line. It's also a really good way of, Kia used it incredibly effectively to get around I'm just not sure how well it will go in the long term, right? There's an interesting sort of field of thinking around how humans make decisions. It was developed by two guys, a guy called Danny Kahneman and Amos Tversky, two Israeli psychologists. And they were responsible for the thinking that led to things like behavioral economics, for example. And they posited that there are two key heuristics that people use when they're making a decision. The first one was, does it look like it's the best product? in terms of I'm looking at it all next to each other, which one looks good. And so I think Kia was doing pretty well on that. Like on paper, it looks really good. But the other part of the decision-making process that people have was it's kind of like a forward projection. It's future safety. So like it might look good now, but will it keep doing it? And so what a 7-year warranty did was give people permission to take that risk, if you know what I mean. So you're kind of backing that up. Will it make people hold cars longer? Quite possibly. But again, it was going there already. I mean, I do think it's interesting as well. If I go back and think, when did this rash of 5-year warranties start? I don't think I'm really even seeing most of them coming through at 5 years of ownership yet, if that makes sense. In other words, I don't think we've really seen it yet. I know that we're only just seeing really the first wave of the 7-year warranty Kias coming back now. Because if you think about it, we're in 2021, and I think it was 2013 or something, 2014 that they brought in that 7-year warranty. They're only expiring now. So it takes a long time to see these cycles. I will keep an eye out for that one, Mark. I don't know. I will be really interested to see. Yeah. Again, a couple of things I would counsel is, I love how optimistic the industry is, but I do think we've got to be realistic about who's coming back, why they're coming back, and what sort of growth is possible. What I would hate to see is, as a market, we all accept that things are going to go crazy again and we can all buy all these cars and then flog them. I would hate to see us go back to cybercar land, because I think we've made, as an industry, some really good progress on that in the last year or so. So that would be, don't get over-optimistic, but focus on looking after the customers that do show up. They're there because they want to buy a car. Give them a good experience. That to me is probably absolutely vital. I do think we also, again, probably, and particularly perhaps in dealer land, is to remind people that where the heart of the market really is. It might not be so much fun selling a car to a 55-year-old woman, but believe me, she is where the money's at. They are the people that you need to sell to. If you're not winning in that group, you're not going to win. You can't chase youth and think that you're going to win it as a brand. There's simply not enough out there. So I would love to think that we could get a little bit, be it marketing and in dealership, and a little bit more respect or acknowledgement that people who are only just, but I'm not quite 50, but I'm almost there. But people who, that's really where the money in the market is. And the more a brand could. It doesn't have to say old, right? I would think you'd agree that most 65-year-olds don't even look 65. They're running around, they're doing all sorts of things. But again, people like to see themselves represented sometimes in marketing. And I would like to think that eventually the automotive market might actually start talking to the people who actually buy its cars. That's just, But I will be probably in the grave before that happens. So, that's just the nature of it. Look, I would love the industry to start thinking about the opportunities for online sales, but also the reasons why the appetite is probably there. In other words, I do believe that a car is a absolutely tangible, visceral object. You need to touch it and feel it. In other words, we will always need to maintain some ability for a potential customer to go and sit in a vehicle. I think that should be a wake-up call to dealerships about how they treat their salespeople and the sort of experience that salespeople can deliver. And equally, if you want to buy loyalty, one of the things I didn't touch on before was one of the advantages of online sales is we can get rid of a lot of the data problems. You've all worked inside OEMs. You know how difficult it is to get accurate data on leads and on conversion, and to make sure that you stay in contact with that customer, and that address detail updates made in the dealership land, that do they ever come back into your primary CRM systems? All of those things could be really well addressed by an online sale because you control that conversation on the way through. But I equally know that a brand and dealers have never quite reconciled who's responsible. And I do think that would be one thing I would love to see, is them to figure out how they want to deal with this future. When you've got one dealer group that is bigger than all bar one manufacturer, you've got a bit of a problem because there's no master. And I do think that's something as an industry we need to deal with. Honda is attempting it. Merck is looking at it. The agency models that have been trialled in New Zealand. There are lots of different ways that this could all pop up. But I do think no matter how I look at it, it's an opportunity for the whole industry to look at ways of delivering a better experience and getting to know their customers better. Stop thinking about it in terms of features. What is the benefit to the customer? How are your needs evolving? How do our products help you meet those needs? Rather than, we've got this new shiny thing. I think that it's about relationship marketing. I think so many other categories, you would agree that one of the reasons you're loyal is because they treat you well. Wouldn't it be nice if we could say that about the auto industry?
Thank you for sharing the update with us today. I'm keen to summarise just some of the things you've covered, because I think there's some really good takeaways. And the big thing is the no overseas travel and the instant asset write-off. You saw that in the data, and it came through very strong for the small fleets with LCVs, but also with luxury cars too, for those small medium enterprises really picking up on the LCVs and luxury cars. And you're right, the sky was falling a year ago, but what COVID has done is accelerated those trends that were happening before. And this is where the swing to the boomers are still a big part of the market and shouldn't be overlooked in how we market and how we interact with them. And the omni-channel that you talked about, we talk about digital, and we had a podcast with Michelle Denogian from Roadster, where in the US they saw, and your data also indicates that if you do digital, you've got to match it with what the experience is in the dealership, and you can't have a disconnect between the two. Otherwise, it's not really an efficient process. But you did highlight something about with the boomers and luxury cars. They weren't affected because job issues or job losses didn't impact them. But what we saw was, or what we have seen, is the jobs have returned, but there is no real wage growth. We're seeing real estate growth. We're seeing share market rebound. So the boomers that have real estate and share market exposure are getting wealthier, and they're not going overseas. So that even exacerbates their exposure to buying new cars, and they'll do their holidays, etc. But it's interesting that you also mentioned there's that further swing around the middle, which is the medium-sized vehicles that are purchased, medium SUVs that are purchased by families. That demographic is shrinking in representation in the new car market because they're actually doing a bit tougher. Whereas if you're cashed up as a boomer or an empty nester, you've got more of that disposable income. And then when we looked at the average price, it's actually moved up from $45,000 to $50,000 within a 12-month period. So we've gone through one of the biggest pandemics and recessions that we potentially have seen, and we've come out with price increases, more cars being sold, and more high-end vehicles being sold. And when we look at the fuel types, LPG is totally gone. Diesel is in demise. There's some LCVs that still have them, but otherwise it's gone out of passenger and even reducing in the SUV market. Petrol is still the mainstay, but there's this 20% purchase intention for electric vehicles or electric hybrids. So we're seeing if you've got an EV that looks like a normal passenger car and is less than $5,000 more expensive than a normal petrol or internal combustion vehicle, there's an adoption for those vehicles. And RAV and Corolla are good examples of it. Whereas if you're buying a purely electric car that is many tens of thousands of dollars more than the equivalent ICE vehicle, the 50 pluses who are cashed up. So there's a real job to be done to get EVs to jump that innovator and early adopter gap, or that as you go into the early majority, late majority, that's where hybrids potentially are. EVs are still very much down here in the early adopter phase. But it's interesting. I thought was the feedback you're getting with the comments is same car but cheaper to run. That's the experience that they're talking about. And not enough of the market have experienced EVs. But once again, it's the reason, why do you buy a car? You don't buy it because of the propulsion system. You buy a new car because there's a change in your life circumstances. And that's interesting, John. It's a bit similar to the podcast we did with Gina from realestate.com. You change your house because of a change in lifestyle circumstances. Either kids leave or kids come, or there's a change in job or something like that. It's why you will change your house. And the same thing happens with a car. So it's less about the car falling apart because they're keeping them for 8 years on average anyway. The warranties are good. The service is improving, so they're staying with their franchise dealers for longer, but they're still leaving because the franchise dealers haven't given them enough reasons to stay. And then going forward, the goal and the dream is to not go back to the cybercar situation that we had in 2016-17, where I estimate probably close to 200,000 cars in this country were cybercars. And we go back to focusing on the customer experience in the dealerships. And this is where it gets back to selling the cars for what they actually can do for the customer, not so much about the feature. It's about the benefit to them. So I share your optimism. I think it's exciting times, and if you can get that omni-channel right with the digital experience matched with the showroom experience and keep the customer at the center of everything that we do, whether it be sales or after sales, that's a winner for the industry. And the industry still has a long way to go. It's improving, which is great, but the industry has a long way to go to improve its perception with customers and with the overall community.
Absolutely. Beautifully summarised. How did you do that? An hour's conversation in 5 minutes, mate. Beautifully done.
Well, Ben, it's all your data and your input. And once again, thank you for coming on the show today. It's always enjoyable having you on. Your wisdom and the value that you provide to this industry definitely cannot be understated. And if anyone needs further information, I encourage them to reach out to you on LinkedIn to get further insights and explore further opportunities.
Thanks, gents. It's been an absolute pleasure. Always love chatting to you both. It really is fun. So thank you for having me.
Yeah, Ben, thanks very much. It's been really enjoyable. To me, it's fascinating, the amount of info and the way you're able to dig into that data and come up with insights on that. So thanks very much from our side.
Thanks, guys. Really appreciate it.
Thanks very much for listening. If you liked what you heard, press the button below to subscribe to our channel, or you can follow us on LinkedIn. You can also find us on Spotify and iTunes. And if you want to know anything more about what we're doing, please reach out to either myself, John Sinclair, or Mark Palavestra.